The crack of Sheriff Caldwell's revolver splitting the morning air sent birds scattering from the courthouse oak as Jake Morrison stepped protectively in front of Sarah Washington and her infant son, his weathered hands steady despite facing down 20 armed townspeople who believed the young black widow had poisoned their well water. 3 months earlier, Jake had been nothing more than a broken-down cattle rancher drowning his war guilt in whiskey. But watching Sarah clutch her baby with the same fierce desperation his own wife had shown during the Confederate raids changed something fundamental in his soul. The crowd pressed closer, their voices rising with accusations of murder and demands for immediate justice, while Sarah stood frozen between the man who had bought her labor contract at auction and the mob that wanted her blood. When Silas Crane spat tobacco juice at her feet and called for a rope, Jake's jaw tightened with the same resolve that had carried him through Shiloh and Antietam, because some battles were worth dying for regardless of the odds. Sarah whispered behind him that she would face whatever punishment awaited her if it meant sparing Jake and protecting her son. But the rancher had already made his choice the day he spent his last $50 to outbid the brothel owner at the courthouse steps. Reverend Matthews pushed through the crowd with his Bible clutched against his chest, his face pale with the knowledge that his small Texas town stood on the precipice of committing an act that would stain their souls forever. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty square as Jake Morrison realized that saving Sarah Washington would require him to confront not just an angry mob, but the corrupt men who had destroyed both their families and hidden their crimes behind badges and false righteousness. Jake Morrison had survived the war, buried his family, and lost his faith. But he would discover that redemption sometimes comes disguised as a desperate woman and her child standing on an auction block. The dust settled around their boots as the crowd slowly dispersed, muttering threats and promises of justice. Jake kept his hand steady on his holstered Colt until the last man disappeared around the corner of Henderson's general store. Sarah's breathing came shallow and quick behind him, her baby finally quiet against her chest. Sheriff Caldwell holstered, his weapon, but his eyes never left Jake's face. "This ain't over, Morrison. Town's got a right to protect itself. Town's got a right to the truth." Caldwell's boots scraped against the wooden planks as he stepped closer. "Truth is what keeps folks safe at night. You'd do well to remember that." The sheriff's spurs jangled as he walked away, leaving Jake and Sarah alone in the square. The morning sun climbed higher, casting harsh shadows between the buildings. Sarah shifted the baby to her other arm, her movements careful and deliberate. "Why?" Her voice came barely above a whisper. Jake turned to face her fully for the first time since the confrontation began. Dark circles shadowed her eyes. Her dress, once fine cotton, showed the wear of months without proper care. The baby's tiny fist curled around a corner of her shawl. "Because it needed doing." She studied his face with the intensity of someone who had learned to read danger in small gestures. "Men don't risk their lives for strangers without reason." Jake's throat tightened. The morning was already growing warm, but something cold settled in his chest. "Maybe I had my reasons." Sarah's eyes flickered toward the church at the end of the street, where Reverend Matthews still stood on the steps. The preacher raised his hand in a small wave before disappearing inside. The gesture felt like a benediction they desperately needed. "I should go," Sarah said. "Take Samuel and leave town before nightfall." "Where would you go?" The question hung between them like smoke from a dying fire. Sarah had no answer because they both knew the truth. A black woman alone with an infant had few choices in Texas, and none of them were good. Jake's horse stamped impatiently at the hitching post. The animal's reins hung loose, but it stayed put. Like everything else in Jake's life, it had learned to wait without expectation. "You still owe me 3 months. Work," Jake said finally. Sarah's laugh came sharp and bitter. "You think I can work for you after this? After what just happened?" "I think you got nowhere else to go." The baby stirred in her arms, making small sounds that weren't quite crying. Sarah bounced him gently, a motion so automatic it seemed unconscious. The tenderness in the gesture made Jake's chest ache with memory. "Why did you really buy my contract?" she asked. Jake looked past her toward the mountains that rose like broken teeth against the horizon. His ranch sat somewhere in that direction, 15 miles of hard country, where a man could disappear if he wanted to, where a woman and child could disappear too. My wife used to hold our boy the same way. The words came out before he could stop them. Sarah's expression softened, but she didn't speak. The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of things that couldn't be undone. They're gone, Jake added, though she hadn't asked. The war? After? Sarah nodded as if she understood. Maybe she did. Loss had a way of marking people, making them recognizable to each other across the spaces that society tried to enforce. The baby began to fuss in earnest now, his small cries echoing off the storefronts. Sarah opened her satchel and withdrew, a small bottle. Her movements were efficient, practiced. The child latched onto the bottle with desperate hunger. When did he last eat? Jake asked. Yesterday morning. The admission hung between them like an accusation. Jake felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of the tight knot that had lived there for months. This woman had faced down a mob while her child went hungry. She had stood straight and dignified while men called for her blood. My ranch is 15 miles north, Jake said. Got a creek runs through it year-round. Good water. Clean. Sarah looked up from feeding her son. You're serious about the work contract? I'm serious about keeping you alive. The church bell tolled the hour, its bronze voice carrying across the empty square. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. Normal sounds from a normal morning, as if the world hadn't just tilted on its axis. What happens when they come for me at your ranch? Jake's hand moved to his gun belt, adjusting the weight without conscious thought. They won't. You can't know that. I know Sheriff Caldwell. I know how men like him think. They want easy solutions to complicated problems. You disappear from town, you become somebody else's problem. Sarah finished feeding the baby and lifted him to her shoulder, patting his back with gentle precision. And if you're wrong? Jake mounted his horse and looked down at her. The morning light caught the exhaustion in her face, but also something else. Strength, the kind that came from surviving things that should have broken her. Then we'll face it when it comes. He extended his hand toward her. Sarah looked at it for a long moment, weighing choices that weren't really choices at all. Finally, she reached up and let him pull her onto the horse behind him. The baby settled between them, warm and quiet. As they rode out of town, Jake felt the weight of watching eyes from windows and doorways. Let them watch. Let them wonder. He had made his choice in that dusty square, and there was no taking it back now. The road north stretched ahead of them, winding through country that could hide secrets if a man knew how to keep them. Jake Morrison had learned many things in his 43 years, but keeping secrets might be the most important skill of all. The Morrison ranch squatted against the horizon like a wounded animal. Broken fence posts leaned at odd angles. The barn door hung on one hinge, creaking in the wind that never seemed to stop. Jake's horse picked its way carefully around holes. In the yard where rain had washed away the topsoil, Sarah dismounted without waiting for help. She held Samuel close as she surveyed the decay that surrounded them. Weeds grew tall around the porch steps. A window on the second floor had been boarded over with rough planks. How long since you worked the land? She asked. Jake tied his horse to a post that looked sturdy enough to hold. 2 years, maybe 3. The creek ran clear and cold behind the house, its voice the only sound that seemed alive in this place. Sarah knelt beside it and cupped water in her palm. She tasted it carefully, then nodded. Water's good. Told you it was. She walked the perimeter of the house while Jake watched from the porch. Her steps were measured, deliberate. She noted the cracked foundation stones, the missing shingles, the garden plot that had gone to seed. Samuel gurgled contentedly in her arms, the first happy sound Jake had heard from the child. You got tools? Sarah asked. Some. Seed. Might be some. Old packets in the kitchen. Sarah climbed the porch steps and pushed open the front door. The hinges protested with a shriek that made the baby startle. Inside, dust covered everything like a burial shroud. Empty bottles sat on the kitchen table beside a deck of cards scattered as if someone had walked away mid-hand. She set Samuel on a blanket in the corner and began opening cupboards. Most were empty. A few contained dishes covered in grime. One held a bottle of whiskey, half empty. Jake appeared in the doorway. "There's a room upstairs you and the boy can use." Sarah looked at the bottle in her hand, then at him. "When's the last time you touched this?" "Yesterday morning." She poured the whiskey out the window in a steady stream. The liquid caught the sunlight as it fell, amber and gold against the gray boards of the porch below. "Hey now," Jake started. "You want help with this place, you stay sober." Jake's jaw tightened. For a moment, Sarah thought he might reach for the bottle or order her off his land. Instead, he picked up one of the scattered cards and placed it carefully on the table. Fair enough. The first week passed in small battles against neglect. Sarah scrubbed floors while Samuel slept in a wooden crate lined with old quilts. Jake repaired fence posts with movements that grew steadier each day without liquor. They worked in parallel lines that rarely crossed, like dancers who knew the steps but had never practiced together. The second week brought the first visitors. Silas Crane rode up on a black mare that matched his temperament. He sat the horse like a man accustomed to being seen. His coat was clean despite the dust of the road. His smile showed too many teeth. "Jake Morrison," he called from the yard. "Heard you been playing house." Jake emerged from the barn with a hammer in his hand. Sarah appeared on the porch, Samuel in her arms. The baby's presence seemed to make Crane's smile widen. "That's a fine-looking boy," Crane said. "Shame he ain't got proper care." "He's got what he needs." Crane's eyes moved from Sarah to Jake and back again. "Town folks are talking, wondering if you know what you got yourself into. Let them wonder. Some folks think maybe I should have won that auction. Think maybe I'd know better how to handle certain situations." Jake's grip on the hammer tightened. "Auction's over." Crane touched the brim of his hat in Sarah's direction. The gesture looked polite but felt like a threat. "Ma'am, you ever get tired of playing farmhand, you know where to find me." He wheeled his horse around and rode away at an easy lope. The dust from his departure hung in the air long after the sound of hoofbeats faded. "He'll be back," Sarah said. "I know." That night, Jake sat on the porch while Sarah put Samuel to bed upstairs. The lamplight from the window cast her shadow on the wall as she moved around the room. When she came downstairs, she carried a worn leather Bible. "Found this in the bedroom." Jake recognized it immediately. His wife's Bible, the one they'd read from every evening after supper. The pages were soft with handling, marked with pressed flowers she'd collected. "She liked the Psalms," he said. Sarah opened the book carefully. The pages fell to Psalm 23, where a dried wildflower marked the place. "You want me to read?" Jake nodded. Her voice was soft in the darkness, the familiar words carrying across the years like echoes of better times. When she finished, the silence between them felt different, less guarded. "You know letters pretty well," Jake said. "My mother taught me. Before the war. Could you teach someone else?" Sarah looked at him in the lamplight. His face was half in shadow, but she could see something vulnerable in his expression. "You want to learn proper? Might be useful." The next morning, Sarah found Jake at the kitchen table with the Bible open in front of him. His finger traced the words slowly, his lips moving silently. She set a cup of coffee beside him and sat down. "Try this verse," she said, pointing to a passage. Jake struggled through the words, stopping and starting. Sarah's corrections were gentle but firm. When he finished, she nodded approval. Better. Over the following days, their morning lessons became routine. Jake learned to sound out words while Sarah balanced the ranch's long-neglected books. The numbers told a story of slow decline, but not beyond hope. "You could run cattle on the south pasture," Sarah said one evening. "Fence needs repair, but the grass is good. Takes money to buy cattle. Takes money to buy seed too, but look." She showed him the ledger where she'd calculated the cost of basic repairs against potential income. Her handwriting was careful and clear, each figure precisely placed. You did all this? Numbers don't lie. Land like this, with water, it wants to produce. Jake studied the pages. For the first time in years, the future looked like something other than slow surrender. Sheriff Caldwell arrived on a Thursday morning while Jake was splitting wood. He came alone, which seemed like a good sign until Sarah saw his face. "Morrison, need to talk." Jake set down his axe. "About what?" "About keeping the peace. Folks in town are getting restless." Sarah stepped onto the porch with Samuel. Caldwell's eyes fixed on the baby with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "Cute child," Caldwell said. "Be a shame if anything happened to him." The words hung in the air like gun smoke. Jake's hand moved toward his gun belt. "That a threat, Sheriff?" "That's friendly advice. Sometimes the best way to protect something precious is to keep it far away from trouble." Caldwell tipped his hat and rode away, but his message was clear. The fragile peace they'd built was balanced on a knife's edge, and someone was already testing how sharp it was. Samuel's fever broke on the same night Sarah's secrets finally surfaced. The baby had been burning with sickness for 3 days, his small body racked with chills that nothing seemed to touch. Sarah barely slept, walking the floor with him while Jake boiled water and fetched clean cloths. When the fever finally passed, Sarah collapsed into the kitchen chair and wept. Not the quiet tears Jake had seen before, but deep sobs that seemed to come from somewhere beyond exhaustion. "He's going to be fine," Jake said. Sarah looked up at him with eyes red from crying and sleepless nights. "You don't understand. They always get sick first." "Who gets sick first?" The question hung between them like smoke from a dying fire. Sarah wiped her face with the back of her hand and stared out the window toward the creek. Dawn was breaking, over the mountains, painting the sky the color of old blood. The children, before their parents die. Jake set down the cloth he'd been holding. Something cold settled in his stomach. "Sarah, what happened to your husband?" She was quiet for so long Jake thought she might not answer. Samuel slept peacefully in his crate, his breathing finally steady and calm. The morning birds began their songs outside the window. "He wasn't killed in any Indian raid." The words came out flat and hard, like stones dropped into still water. Jake sat down across from her at the table. "Thomas was investigating something. Government supplies that were supposed to go to the fort. Blankets, medicine, food, things that folks needed to survive the winter." Jake's hands found his coffee cup, though the liquid had gone cold hours ago. "What kind of supplies?" "The kind that never made it where they were supposed to go. The kind that ended up sold to private buyers while settlers died of fever and hunger." Sarah stood and walked to the window. Her reflection looked like a ghost against the morning light. Thomas found records, bills of sale, names of men who were supposed to protect folks but were robbing them instead. "What men?" Sarah turned to face him. "Sheriff Caldwell, 3 others from town, and someone higher up the chain, someone with real authority." Jake felt the world shift beneath him like unstable ground. "You got proof?" Sarah walked to the corner where she kept her few possessions. She reached into the bottom of her satchel and withdrew a leather portfolio wrapped in oiled cloth. Her hands shook as she untied the strings. "Thomas hid these with me the night before he died. Said if anything happened to him I should take them to the territorial governor." The papers inside were covered with careful handwriting. Lists of supplies, dates, signatures. Jake couldn't read all the words, but he recognized some of the names. Town council members, the bank president. Sheriff Caldwell's signature appeared on half the documents. "How long you been carrying these?" 8 months. Jake stared at the papers spread across his kitchen table. "Why didn't you take them to the governor?" Sarah's laugh came bitter and sharp. "Take them how? A black woman traveling alone with a baby? How far you think I'd get before Caldwell's friends caught up with me?" The truth of it hit Jake like a physical blow. She'd been trapped from the moment Thomas died, carrying evidence that could hang men but unable to use it without signing her own death warrant. "There's more," Sarah said quietly. Jake looked up from the papers. Sarah's face had gone pale in the morning light. Samuel's been sick because the water here is bad, not the creek water, the well water in town. Someone's been poisoning it slow, making folks sick so they'll buy medicine from the same men who stole their supplies. That's not possible. Look at the dates. Every time there's a big shipment of medicine that goes missing, folks in town start getting sick 2 weeks later. Always the children first, then the old folks. Jake studied the papers again. The pattern was there once you knew how to look for it. Supply theft followed by mysterious illness followed by desperate families paying high prices for medicine that should have been free. They're killing people for profit and blaming it on bad luck or God's will. Jake pushed back from the table and walked to the window. The creek ran clear and bright in the morning sun, but now he could see the shadow underneath its beauty. If Sarah was right, the whole town was being slowly murdered by the men sworn to protect it. We have to take this to someone. Who? Caldwell's the law. The town council's in his pocket. Who's going to believe us? Jake turned to face her. The territorial governor, like your husband planned. I told you I can't travel alone. You won't be alone. Sarah stared at him. You'd do that? Risk everything on the word of a woman you bought at auction? I'd do it because it's right. For the first time since he'd known her, Sarah smiled, not the careful, guarded expression she usually wore, but something real and warm. There's something else you need to know, Jake said, about why I believe you. He walked to his desk and pulled out a letter yellowed with age. The paper cracked as he unfolded it. My brother David wrote this a week before he died. Said he'd found something wrong with the supply shipments coming through his section. Said he was going to report it to his captain. Sarah took the letter and read it carefully. When did he die? 3 years ago. Supposed to be a Confederate. Raid on his patrol. But the timing never made sense. War was almost over. Why would rebels risk men for a supply train in the middle of nowhere? Because it wasn't rebels. The words hung between them like a revelation and a curse. Jake had suspected for years that something about David's death didn't add up, but he'd buried his doubts under whiskey and grief. They killed my brother. They killed your husband. How many others? Sarah folded the letter carefully and handed it back to him. Enough to make themselves rich. Outside, a rider approached through the morning mist. Jake recognized Sheriff Caldwell's silhouette before the man's face became clear. The sheriff sat his horse like a man who owned the world and everything in it. Looks like we're about to find out how much time we have left, Jake said. Sarah gathered the papers quickly and wrapped them back in their oiled cloth. He knows something. He wouldn't come here this early unless something had changed. Caldwell dismounted and walked to the porch with the casual confidence of a man who expected doors to open before him. Jake met him on the front steps. Sheriff, early for a social call. Ain't social, Morrison. Got reports of contaminated water out this way. Thought I should check on the woman and her baby. Through the window, Jake could see Sarah holding Samuel close. The baby looked healthy now, but Jake understood the real message. Caldwell knew the child had been sick. He knew why. Water's fine here. Good to hear. Course, sometimes these things take time to show up. Sometimes whole families get sick before anybody realizes what's happening. Caldwell's eyes never left Jake's face, but his meaning was clear. The illness could come back any time Caldwell wanted it to. We'll keep that in mind. You do that. And Morrison. Might be wise to send that woman and her boy somewhere safer. Town's getting restless about having her so close. For her own protection, you understand. Caldwell mounted his horse and rode away without waiting for an answer. Jake watched until the dust settled, then went back inside where Sarah waited, with the portfolio clutched against her chest. They both knew their time was up. The town meeting was supposed to start at 7. By 6:30, the street outside the courthouse was packed with bodies that moved like storm clouds gathering before a twister. Jake tied his horse to the rail and helped Sarah down with Samuel in her arms. The baby slept despite the noise, his small face peaceful against his mother's shoulder. Reverend Matthews appeared at Jake's elbow. You sure about this? Sure enough. The preacher's hands shook as he adjusted his collar. Caldwell's got half the town believing she poisoned the well. Other half's ready to listen, but they're scared. Sarah looked at the crowd pressing toward the courthouse doors. Men she'd seen in passing over the months now stared at her with open hostility. Women whispered behind their hands and pulled their children closer. Maybe I should go, she said quietly. Jake's hand found the small of her back. We go together. Inside, the courthouse was thick with tobacco smoke and sweaty bodies. Oil lamps cast dancing shadows on the walls. Sheriff Caldwell stood at the front of the room beside a table covered with glass vials and official-looking papers. Ladies and gentlemen, Caldwell began, his voice carrying easily over the crowd. We got ourselves a situation. The room fell silent, except for crying babies and shuffling feet. Caldwell held up one of the vials. The liquid inside was dark and murky. This here's water from the Morrison Ranch well. Had it tested by a specialist in Austin. Jake felt Sarah stiffen beside him. The lie was smooth and confident, delivered, with the authority of a badge and years of trust. Results show contamination. Poison that's been making our children sick. A woman near the front stood up. My little girl's been fevering for days. Doctor can't figure why. Because someone's been putting things in our water that don't belong there, Caldwell said. His eyes found Sarah in the crowd. Someone who knows about herbs and potions. Someone who might have reason to want revenge on decent folks. The crowd began to murmur. Jake heard his name mixed with Sarah's, heard accusations building like thunder in the distance. Now hold on, called a voice from the back. It was Henderson from the general store. Morrison's been trading with me for years. He ain't never caused trouble. Morrison ain't the problem, Caldwell said. Problem is who he's harboring, who he's letting have access to our water supply. A man Jake didn't recognize stood up. What you proposing we do about it? I'm proposing we handle this legal and proper. Arrest the woman for questioning. Keep her somewhere safe while we sort out the truth. Sarah's grip on Samuel tightened. Jake knew what Caldwell's version of safe questioning would look like. He also knew this was the moment they'd been building toward since that first day in the town square. Jake stood up. The room's attention shifted to him like iron filings drawn to a magnet. Sheriff's right about poison in the water, he said. Just wrong about who's doing the poisoning. Caldwell's face went still. Morrison, you don't know what you're talking about. I know about government supplies that never made it to the fort. I know about medicine that got sold to private buyers while folks died of fever. Jake pulled out the portfolio Sarah had carried for 8 months. The leather was worn smooth from handling, but the papers inside were crisp and clear. I got bills of sale, shipping manifests, names and dates going back 3 years. The crowd stirred uneasily. Jake saw confusion replacing anger on some faces. That's nonsense, Caldwell said, but his voice had lost its confident edge. Sarah stepped forward. Samuel was awake now, looking around the room with wide eyes that seemed to take in everything. My husband was killed for finding these papers, she said. Her voice was quiet, but it carried in the sudden silence. Thomas Washington, Buffalo soldier, 10th Cavalry, shot down like a dog because he wouldn't let children die for profit. Now, see here, began the bank president, but Jake cut him off. Your name's on half these documents, Miller. Want me to read them out loud? Miller sat down quickly. His face had gone the color of old paper. Reverend Matthews stood up. Let him read them. Jake opened the first document. His reading was slow but clear, each word weighted with months of patient lessons at Sarah's side. Bill of sale, 50 crates medical supplies. Intended destination, Fort Crawford. Actual destination, Miller's Pharmacy. Signed by Sheriff Robert Caldwell. The crowd erupted. Voices rose in anger and confusion. Some people pushed toward the doors while others demanded to hear more. That's a forgery, Caldwell shouted over the noise. Here's another one, Jake said. And another. Dozens of them. all signed by men this town trusted. A woman near the front began to cry. My husband died last winter. Couldn't afford medicine for his pneumonia. Medicine that should have been free, Sarah said. Medicine your tax dollars already paid for. Caldwell's hand moved toward his gun. The gesture was small, but Jake caught it. He shifted his weight, ready to draw if necessary. You got any proof this woman didn't poison our water? Caldwell demanded. I got proof who did poison it, Jake said. He pulled out his brother's letter. The paper was fragile with age, but David's handwriting was still legible. My brother David Morrison, killed 3 years ago investigating the same supply thefts. Wrote this letter a week before he died. Jake read his brother's words aloud. The details matched perfectly with Sarah's documents. Supply routes, dates, suspicious deaths that followed too closely after investigations began. The courthouse had gone completely quiet, except for the sound of Sarah's baby making small noises against her shoulder. They killed my brother, Jake said. They killed her husband. They've been killing this town slow for years and blaming God or bad luck. Caldwell drew his gun. The movement was fast and practiced, but not fast enough. Jake's Colt cleared leather. First, the two men faced each other across 20 feet of charged air while the crowd scrambled for cover. Put it down, Sheriff, Jake said. You're harboring a murderer. I'm protecting an innocent woman. She poisoned our children. You poisoned our children. The accusation hung between them like smoke from a funeral pyre. In the silence that followed, Jake heard Sarah's steady breathing behind him. Heard Samuel's contented gurgling, heard his own heart beating against his ribs. Prove it, Caldwell said. Sarah stepped forward with Samuel in her arms. The water at Jake's ranch comes from a clean creek. The poison's in the town well. Check the mine runoff upstream. Check who owns that mine. Miller tried to stand up and leave, but Henderson blocked his path. Going somewhere, Miller? The pieces fell together like dominoes in the crowd's mind. The mine upstream, the contaminated town water, the medicine shortage that followed every outbreak of sickness. Caldwell's gun wavered. This is all speculation. Then let's test it, called Dr. Peterson from the middle of the crowd. Take water, samples from the creek, from the mine, from the town well. See what's really making folks sick. Test my baby's blood, too, Sarah said. If I'd been poisoning folks, he'd show signs. The logic was simple and undeniable. Caldwell's conspiracy was unraveling thread by thread. You're all fools, Caldwell snarled, believing a murderer over your own sheriff. I believe the evidence, Reverend Matthews said. I believe in justice. One by one, the townspeople voiced their agreement. The tide had turned completely. Caldwell found himself facing a room full of people who finally understood how they'd been betrayed. He lowered his gun. The fight went out of him like air from a punctured balloon. 3 days later, Jake stood in the same courthouse for a different kind of ceremony. Sarah wore a simple white dress that belonged to the preacher's wife. Samuel gurgled happily in Reverend Matthews's arms while the man performed the wedding ceremony. The whole town came to watch. The same people who'd called for Sarah's blood now brought wedding gifts and congratulations. Shame had a way of making folks generous with their second chances. Caldwell and his conspirators were on their way to the territorial prison. The mine had been shut down and the water was already running cleaner. Dr. Peterson confirmed that Samuel's blood showed no signs of poison, just the normal illnesses that came with being a baby in a hard country. As Jake slipped the ring onto Sarah's finger, he thought about the long journey that had brought them to this moment. Two broken people who'd found each other in the worst of circumstances and somehow built something worth saving. You may kiss your bride, Reverend Matthews said. Jake looked into Sarah's eyes and saw his future there. Not perfect or easy, but real and honest and worth fighting for. The kiss was gentle and brief, but it sealed a promise that went deeper than words. They'd face whatever came next together, as husband and wife, as family. Outside the courthouse, the Texas sun shone bright and clean on a town that had learned the difference between justice and revenge, between fear and wisdom, between the easy lie and the difficult truth. And that is all to the story, for now. Please let me know where you are tuning in from. Perhaps we will create a story there. Consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel. And if you enjoy our content, click this video on your screen. I promise you it's worth watching. See you tomorrow.